The word obscene is used pretty often in general vocabulary. But what does it mean for something to be legally considered obscene? More importantly, how does this obscenity affect you through traditional mediums such as radio and TV, and through the fancy new medium known as the internet? Well, let's dive in. In actuality, there isn't a solid legal definition of the term obscenity. However, the two most common ways to define it simply would be a category of speech unprotected by the First Amendment, as well as lewd, filthy, or disgusting words or pictures. But we've all seen something to that effect on the internet, right? So how is it that we can see disgusting things on the internet legally? Well, the Federal Communications Commission helps us understand why we see things that we might consider obscene on the internet and even TV. The FCC says that content must be proven obscene by a three-pronged test known as the Miller test. Then there's indecent content. Indecent content portrays sexual or excretory organs or activities in a way that does not meet the Miller test criteria. And finally, there is profane content, which includes grossly offensive language. Indecent and profane content are prohibited on broadcast TV and radio between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m., when there is a reasonable risk that children may be in the audience. Obscene content, on the other hand, is prohibited at all times. Indecent and profane content rules do not apply to cable, satellite TV, or satellite radio because they are subscription services. So, the things that you may see on TV and call obscene are actually probably indecent or profane. Also, because the internet is technically a subscription service, indecent and profane content rules don't apply there. So, we know that obscenity has to meet this three-pronged test called the Miller test. But what are these three prongs? Before we get to the Miller test, let's look at some of the history leading up to it. One of the landmark cases that brought the obscenity issue to light would be the case United States versus one book entitled Ulysses. Before this case, two publishers were convicted of publishing an indecent chapter of the book Ulysses while serializing it in their magazine. Years after this case, when the entire book of Ulysses was imported to the United States, there was finally enough evidence to prove that the novel had literary merit. So, the case United States versus Ulysses was born. A judge by the name of John M. Woolsey decided that they should look at the work as a whole instead of in parts like cases in the past. This view was upheld on appeal, and the court claimed the same immunity should apply to literature as to science, where the presentation, when viewed objectively, is sincere, and the erotic matter is not introduced to promote lust. This was the first standard set forth towards obscenity. The next landmark case would be Roth versus United States. This case came about because a man named Samuel Roth was convicted of mailing obscene circulars as well as an obscene book. Two important outcomes would come from this case. The first is that the opinion first voiced in the Ulysses case would be used in looking at Roth's conviction. This further solidified the idea of looking at works as a whole. The second outcome would be the establishment that obscene material is not protected by the First Amendment. After the Roth case comes the one we've all been waiting for, Miller versus California. This is the case that established the obscenity test that is still used today. In this case, Marvin Miller, aka the King of Smut, was prosecuted for mailing 4 ads and a book that was considered obscene content. He was convicted and tried to appeal at a California appeals court and the Supreme Court, but both courts upheld his conviction. In this case, Warren E. Berger established what is known as the Miller test. The Miller test determines whether something is obscene or not based on 1. Whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work taken as a whole appeals to prurient interest. 2. Whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law. And 3. Whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. In simpler terms, the 3 points would be 1. Whether or not the standards of the local community find the entire work excessively sexual. 2. Whether or not the work shows sexual acts directly. And 3. Whether or not the work is actually important in some area of the public's culture. Even after looking at the Miller test, determining obscenity is still a murky area, and the internet makes it even murkier. In the past, obscenity was based on a localized community standard, but the internet blurs those local lines. Some believe that we should come up with a national community standard, although some believe it would be tricky to pin down. Take this quote by Amy E. White. "What one person finds offensive, another may not. What excites one person sexually, creates prurient interest, may not excite another. And what one person considers to be of serious value, another may not." I hope this video simplified a little bit of the rabbit hole known as obscenity on the internet. The history of it is pretty murky, and the future of it is still unclear. Many questions are left unsolved. Where should internet obscenity go from here, and what do you think?